Hey everybody, it's Mike Badger from BadgerDad. I'm back with another Dresden Files review, Book 5, Death Masks. This is coming up post my Summer Night review, which if you haven't seen it, you can check it out somewhere, or go to the channel, of course, and find the playlist. I'm keeping the Dresden Files together. This is coming up after the Summer Night Book 4, where I changed up my approach a little bit. Instead of having a spoiler-free video and then a spoiler deep dive video, in Summer Night I tried to make it one, where I have a upfront spoiler light to spoiler free section. There may be minor spoilers, but I'm trying to avoid it in that section. And then I'm going to go into a deep dive where I really dig into the weeds and try to talk through some of my big questions for the series coming out, big questions in the book, characters, relationships, and moments that I think stood out in a way that's unusual. That's what I'm planning to do for this video as well. So I will have timestamps below in the video description if you want to know where to jump to. Let's jump into it, shall we? So the first thing with Death Mask, the general premise is we got to bring back the Knights of the Cross. That's what this one's going to be about. As I've said for the other books, each one is Butcher building up an aspect of the world. It's not that multiple aspects aren't introduced in each book, and they are. In this case, he wants to have a story centered around the Knights of the Cross, which means we have to find out who the arch villains are for the Knights of the Cross, which we do. That's the big plot A hook of the book. Typically, Jim Butcher does two plot points. He does a plot A and plot B, sometimes a plot C, but it's usually more buried within one of the two primary plots. And he weaves those together, interchanges them. Harry's being pulled in multiple directions, and it creates a tension dynamic. It's great. This is the first time where I think Butcher realized he has to ramp up the game. He knows later on what's coming. He's going to need way more dynamics, and plot A and plot B are not going to be quite as defined. So what do you do if you have a really massive plot and initially seems massive but is smaller? By comparison, what happens? You get Death Mask, which is the plot A is pretty sound, but it's constantly being pulled down by the plot B, undermines some of the tension and the work that Jim Butcher is doing. And I think this is more the training ground. He's trying something new. He's trying something that at a scale and reach that he hasn't tried before, and it doesn't quite land. In plot A, we have the Knights story arc. And in terms of the mystery, Harry's looking into the magical item for the Vatican. It involves, of course, the Knights, as well as who's trying to do keep away, who's trying to get to that magical item before Harry. That's plot A. Plot B is the wider vampire courts. Now, since book 3, we've had this massive vampire war going on. And in book 4, one of the things I think Butcher struggled with is he kickstarted this massive, potentially global war, and he realized quickly that, well, Harry can't just get into it, nor can massive global powers just start hammering one another. It'd be the equivalent of America and Russia start nuking each other, or America and China start nuking each other. Like, it would be like that. It would be like, okay, we're not at war, so nukes. But that's not really how it goes. Two powers that are too powerful for one another. It doesn't work that way. You move into a Cold War state really fast because you know that if either of you tried to go all in on the other, it would mean mutual destruction. So that's what's going on here. Since book 4, where he kickstarted this war, Butcher pulled back very quickly and lowered the stakes of the conflict into the background. Harry's emotional impact, and he's constantly getting pinged on a personal level for that whole thing, being set up and all sorts of things we talked about in book 4, which you can find my review on the channel. But beyond that, then you have the stakes are still in the background. Then we have a returning character, Paleo Ortega, who came up in book 3 very briefly, and he's back and he wants to try to do something off the books with Harry to wrap up the war. Like, yeah, sure, you can end the war as easily as that plot B dynamic. It is part of this wider vampire conflict, but the conflict has been de-escalated by Butcher to be in the background in book 4, which means in book 5 you have this where suddenly, oh, this is really important, and it's not really, it doesn't feel important because plot A is so important and so apocalyptic that the plot B feels almost silly. You end up getting tugged in multiple directions that just don't make sense. Why would you worry about this Cold War back and forth situation? Yes, it's personal, I get it, but why would you have that going on when you have immediate death and apocalypse on the horizon? That's not how it works. The nuclear bombs are coming, I gotta go. So I think that was probably the biggest structural weakness with the book, and it's Butcher stretching in his muscles. Whereas I really love Death Masks so much, it's the first times I've read it. This reread, which is after a long time having not reread it, I'm starting to notice that there's major structural loss from a plot perspective. However, emotionally, it's one of the most gratifying books. It made me realize that Butcher could write vignettes. He could just write a scene without plot. And the characters he's built over 5 books are now alive. They're now alive. I want to sit and listen to Harry and Michael have a beer. It's ridiculous. I know, it's absurd. But that's where we've gotten to. The characters' work is so good and so subtle, you start to fall in love with the characters. But book 5, wow. Some of the just quiet little moments where they're sitting and talking have more resonance than some of the big action-packed scenes towards the end of the book. This is where I think Butcher shines overall. He's able to find the quiet moments to build the characters in a way that in the moment you don't really notice how much is happening. That's where I think Death Mask lands, which is that from a plot perspective, plot A, so overall is plot B, that the plot dynamic is weaker, it's rougher, the impact isn't quite there, and some of the stakes are almost silly in contrast. But you do get introduction of the Knight's archenemies, which is some of the best villain work of the series to date, introduced to arguably the best villain. We did have Mab last time, where it shows how much Harry's out of his depth. This is the first time where you start to get really scared for Harry. You realize how much out of his depth he is. And at the end of the day, I think if you are along with the Dresden Files so far, if you've liked them to date, I think you'll really like this one, regardless of if the plot lands emotionally for you. Even if you don't feel like the progress was even if you don't feel like it was believable and made an equal impact as you went through the story, the character moments, the emotional arcs and impacts, and the introduction of a fantastic villain set, and just an end game you can see a mile away leading into the future, like seeding for the future. So this is where we end the spoiler light, spoiler free section. And let's dive into the deep nuggets of this book, and let's talk about it. Let's start off with the thing that I want to talk about in part 1, and I really couldn't, which was the Denarians. Oh my god. So not only do we meet the other Knights of the Cross, we meet Shiro and we meet Sanya. So varied and believable in terms of how different they are, their styles, their swords, their religious faith is coming at it from completely different angles. I thought that was excellent. And the Denarians as villains are just amazing stuff. Not only the 30 pieces of silver on how each one coin is representative of a fallen angel, and how Nicodemus has, from the original Judas, has hangman's noose around his neck that prevents him from being hurt, which makes him into this immobile force. He's truly one of these multi-thousand-year mortals that Dresden has to deal with in a way that's almost like Mab. He's not Mab, but like Mab. It makes you think about Mab. And in some ways, I think he's even older than Mab from some of the digging I've done into the background of the characters. And yet at the same time, if you've ever watched Silence of the Lambs with Anthony Hopkins, you know what that first scene where Clarice comes around the corner and he's standing there staring at her and he says, "Good morning," as if she's in the middle of this cage, this dark hole with this madman. And it's as if it's like, "We're having tea. Good morning." It's shiver. There's nothing scary, nothing truly scary about the scene, and it's just shiver-inducing. That's kind of what it felt. Nicodemus walks in like he owns the place, and the first scene, it's almost like thrown away. It's like, oh yeah, he's a cliched villain, and then you get that scene with Harry and him where they're just having a chat, and wow. He just cuts right through the garbage. He cuts through the tropes and the ridiculousness of a lot of the villains. Like the whole thing with this world is that Harry's mocked the villains constantly about how silly and ridiculous and over the top they are, and how they're if I'm just a wise ass, I can always get the villain to get overly angry, make mistakes, do stupid things. And this is where he's like, Nicodemus is like, yeah, right, yeah, that's all nonsense. I'm not revealing my plans. I'm not giving you a sense of anything, and I know exactly what's going on with you, Harry. And that's the thing. When you have a villain who understands your main character so deeply, that's what's really scary. And that's why Silence of the Lambs, Anthony Hopkins in that role was so terrifying, is because Hannibal Lecter in that scene, he saw through Clarice. And you, as extension, you're following Harry, who's the newbie on the block, kind of like she is in that situation. You also are just like, oh man, he sees right through him in such clarity that you realize that Harry's completely outmatched in this instance. And even as it goes on, as by the end of the book with the whole fight scene and everything, Nicodemus is never in trouble. He's never really stuck. It's more about keep away and try to get things out of Nicodemus's immediate vicinity than that we're gonna beat him, which I really liked. I liked introducing a villain who feels like a real villain. Mab never, in book 4, didn't really feel like a villain. None of the fairies felt like villains. They're just their nature. It's who they are. This guy feels villainous. He feels evil. But he also, from his twisted perspective, is so freaking cool. He's, my God. Anyway, I could talk about the Denarians for way too long, so we're going to move past them. And we're going to talk about some other things. We got Marcone coming back, which is fantastic. We got to meet Miss Guard, who is the Valkyrie badass bodyguard. We got to meet her, which is fantastic. Kincaid, Ivy, I mean, from the introduction to the I can't touch the petals, like, that's why I have Kincaid with me. It's like, I can't reach the pedals. To Harry completely underestimating her and not putting up with the whole, like, yeah, you get to just be this faceless zombie robot thing. No, he gives her a name, and it's just, there's so much seeding with those short scenes, but at the same time, man, you really connect so fast, and I love how Butcher built that relationship right from the first brick. And then we had the return of Susan, which actually I thought was one of the weaker parts of the book. Yes, I get the whole, like, Harry's beating himself up about her since end of book 3. So we need to have some form of resolution where he can see she's moving on and getting along, and it's not the end of the world. And also they get a send-off, and it resolves a lot of that sexual and emotional and tension. I get it. Felt put in here when you have so much other stuff going on. It didn't feel necessary. I know later on in the series that there is a reason this is happening here, and the reason it's happening the way it is, but it really felt unnecessary. Then again, I never really liked Susan from the beginning, so whatever. Core thing for me, let's talk a bit about the detail more than just the things I love, because there's so many. Last one, right before we get to that, the scene with the Denarian Cassius, the baseball bat. Oh my, even now, I've read the series before. I freaking love that scene. Yes, I kind of wish Michael had given a little more pushback, but I love that scene so much. That is the heart of what differentiates Harry from the Knight Paladin, the Knight Good Guy. That scene is the epitome of it. And I think that ties to the wider theme of this book. Like, what is Butcher doing? Forget the plot. What's Butcher trying to do with Harry? And it's in your face what he's trying to do with Harry, which is, why does Harry do what he does? Punched into your face over and over. Not just that Nicodemus cuts through the layers of nonsense and shows exactly what Harry's doing, that he's in this like self-denial state of, he's concerned about power, so he denies himself power because he wants to be a protector, but he knows he needs power to be a protector, but he's worried if he gets too much power, he will no longer be a protector, he'll be the villain. That whole dynamic, it's true, it's fine, but it's more than that. It starts to beg the question of, like, why does Harry do what he does? I think it's more of, is it something of a free will component, or is this built into who he is? There's so much implied from multiple characters that make it seem like Harry is one, that he hasn't given much thought to it, yet he does these things anyway, which a lot of people do. We're built as people by society and by our families and by the way we are brought up. We are built into who we are, whether or not we're consciously thinking about it. Hard, you have to go through a lot of self-reflection to find out where you as a person differentiate yourself from your past and where you've come from. It takes a lot of work to do something like that, and Harry hasn't done it. He's a young guy, you realize, even in this book. And at the end of the day, why Harry does what he does is the core running theme of this book. And it sets the stage for that question, the wider series. Like, why is Harry doing what he's doing? Why does he protect people who can't protect themselves to such an extreme? And the answers are not great in this book so far, but the fact that he gets asked that question so often and it's like really on his mind, I think that's the thematic component running through this book, is power and Harry's relationship with it. Why is Harry doing what he's doing? What's his relationship with power? That's the core of the character development of this book, and I think it was very well done. For example, Harry hates when people laugh at him. Early in the book, he just straight out says, like, I hate when people laugh at me. And it's maybe is that the reason why he's such a wise ass, making reflexive jokes all the time against other people, is because he laughs at others because he hates being laughed at himself. Pseudopsychology, I know, but it comes up early on and makes sense. There was some stuff, a lot of asides, that I think one of the things that sets the Dresden Files apart in a way that a lot of other series don't have is that there's a lot more thought-provoking stuff going on. It's not a pure pulp book. It's not like you read it, put it down, and it's completely forgetful. There's a lot of stuff in it. I don't think Butcher is seeding it intentionally. I don't think he's a philosopher trying to get you into some sort of mindset, but he does raise real-world questions that make you think. And the genius of it is that it fleshes out Harry's worldview, where you see he's willing to think of multiple sides of an equation, and he notices things in the world beyond just what's right in front of him at all times. And it makes you start to process this world and the seeding that's going on through these asides that are really interesting. So there's one in the book that I really liked, where he says that they don't make morgues with windows. In fact, if the geography allows for it, they hardly ever make morgues above ground. I guess it's partly because it must be easy to refrigerate a bunch of coffin-sized chambers in a room insinuated by the earth. But that can't be all there is to it. I mean, under the earth, there's a lot more than a relative attitude. It's where dead things fit. Graves are under the earth. So is hell, Gehenna, Hades, a dozen other reported afterlives, and maybe it says something about people. Maybe, for us, under the earth is a subtle and profound statement. Maybe. Ground level provides us with a kind of symbolic boundary marker, an artificial construct that helps us remember that we are alive. Maybe it helps us to push death's shadow back from our lives. I live in a basement apartment and I like it. What does that say about me? Probably that I overanalyze things. I love this little paragraph because it's such a subtle moment, but you start to realize there's a lot of seeding in this little aside in terms of how people work, how people think, what Harry notices, how in this world there's multiple perspectives on what things are. Hell, Gehenna, Hades. Obviously in our world that's this case, but it's more than that. It's that we know that there's an alternative world here going on. And you realize that even in the alternative world, there's so many multiple layers to things. And it gives you a little thought there, well, why do we do that? That's a good question. I don't know. Why do we do that? There's another one, he talks about herd animals, I think in one of the other books, I don't know, maybe Deadbeat, one of the other books from a long time ago. It just stuck with me for years and years. I raised it all the time. This notion of that the predators of this world, the predators exist because the statistics of missing persons matches the herd animals. I'll probably talk about it when I get to that book because it just stuck with me. But it's the same idea. It's like a random aside that's just powerful. So that was really cool. And I love those little asides that he does. There's also a mention from Ursil the Denarian. He says he killed the Egyptian to Shiro. Who is the Egyptian? Why is he bringing him up? Will he show up? Will it matter in the future? Or is it just he's just needling him and you're like, oh, whatever, it's just a throwaway line? It's a good question. We'll have to see what happens. Maybe it was a prior night. There's a continuous plot gap I'm noticing in a couple of books where Harry says he never felt so outclassed. Now, some of this is in the book trying to just build the drama, build the tension. Come on, he's got to be outclassed. Otherwise, how can he be struggling against something that seems overwhelming? But the fact is he uses this line several times in book 4, in book 5, and I'm sure as we go forward, he'll use the line again. But the fact is in book 3, he faced Ferrovax the dragon. It made it quite clear that Harry was so out of his league, he had never been close to something like this before. Almost no one is on par with Ferrovax in this sense. But more that Harry's forgotten about. It's instead of aside from Ferrovax, I think it's just a butcher in the moment for maybe forgetting or just wanting to build the tension in the moment. But at the same time, I do notice that it's a gap. How many times Harry has to be reminded of the scale of him versus some of these immortal beings seemed a bit silly at this point. I think also this is the first time in a book where we have a discussion about time, how time works in the Dresden Files world. Now, the reason this matters is because we know that there is a god or some kind of they call it the white god, I think, some kind of god that the knights work for, which is representative of God within our world. If that being is existing within this world, then there's a notion of a being outside of time. And so we are going to have immortals who live outside of time in a sense. They're within time stream, but they think of time differently. So this is the first time we have a clear distinction about how time starts to work in the Dresden Files. Why does this matter? Because we know there are 7 laws of magic. One of them is you shouldn't time travel. Don't do that. And if you're not supposed to time travel, well, Jim has said in one of his interviews that Harry's supposed to break all the rules at some point, which means if time travel is on the table, you know what that means, right? That means Butcher has to seed time travel stuff for a long part of the series before we get to time travel proper. Otherwise, it's not going to have the same emotional impact as it will if you have a lot of stuff seeded ahead of time. So I thought it was great he started talking about time in book 5 when we know there's 15 books, short stories, and then there's going to be 2 more books. We're already so many books into this series. The fact that in book 5 is where he started talking about time and how it works was great. And it gives you that sense that that's going to come up a lot more later. The archive introduction, I told you she's super cute, awesome. That whole dynamic is very cool. Obviously, her boundaries of power need to be better understood because she seems way overpowered. And how exactly knowledge translates into raw magic is confusing. Doesn't matter though. Awesome scene. Then it was interesting. Didn't catch this originally. I saw someone mention it I think on Reddit somewhere. Harry gets the shroud in an envelope from Father Vincent, the couple pieces of shroud he's going to try to use as a tracking device. And it says the case is like the kind coin collectors use to frame paper money. And I just went like facepalm. Oh my God, Jim. That's the Denarian hint, that Vincent is a Denarian. It comes from a coin collector. A coin collector, frame paper money, Jim. You know, it was one of those moments where I'm like, in hindsight, oh my God. I'd seen it and I noticed it for the first time because of this comment. I was like, oh my God, I can't believe. And you realize if he's doing it that subtly, there's got to be so much more stuff that we're missing. There's also mention of the Jade Court. I want to mention that. Jade Court is the fourth vampire court introduced. We have Red Court, White Court, Black Court, and now Jade Court from Southeast Asia, China, Japan. I think it was Shiro who mentions them. And they're very secretive, respected courts. We don't even know much about them. Will they matter later? We'll have to find out. One thing I did want to mention around the Nicodemus scene with Harry. I know I'm a little out of order slightly here, but I did want to mention that he mentions Harry's afraid of himself, and that's why he limits himself and prohibits himself from expanding his power, his reach, his influence, and so on. But he does hint that Harry's parents were murdered, and this is not the first time, because we've had the demon from earlier in the series, Chaz, whatever his full name is, imply as well that Harry's parents did not die a natural death. And Nicodemus kind of confirms it, which is, ooh, that's mystery. I'm curious what went on there. Then we also found out about the Noose and Anduriel, that Anduriel is the captain of Lucifer's team. He's the leader of the coins. And the Nicodemus-Anduriel relationship is really unique and interesting. And I think him setting the stage here that a person could have a relationship in this way with an immortal being is what it is set up. This is setting the stage that it is possible to do, but it's evil. Or at least you will end up evil, which I think will make a lot of those later bargains a little bit more dynamic. We're introduced to Mordite as well, the anti-life death stone. What's implied here is that it's from the outside, it's not from our universe. The question is, if someone starts slinging it around in a real way, like what does that mean? Like, would it just end existence? Because could you see this being Jim Butcher's nuclear fallout or nuclear end of the world? Because he did mention he's going to have big apocalyptic trilogy at the end. Apocalyptic being the key word there. Does it involve something like Mordite? I mean, it would make sense Mordite's so introduced early on. And we know that Harry's has had an outsider, a shadow of sorts, following him since book one even, where it's mentioned that he's seen with the third eye and he's being followed by He Who Walks Behind. All of this out of our universe stuff as potential, even back to book one, which I think is really cool. And the fact that Mordite's here, is Mordite related at all to the out of the universe being, since it is from out of this universe? Don't know, but I'm sure we're going to see more of it again. There is so much more. This book, as with all the Dresden books, there's seeding going on all over the place, and there's so much more I could talk about. But at the end of the day, I want to keep this open conversation. I want to hear what you guys think. There's stuff that I missed, and I'd love to talk more about it. So if you guys have any thoughts, either you've read it before, and you want to put some comments down below what you thought, or things you're thinking about as well, I'd love to chat with you all in the comment section. So please drop a comment if you enjoy this. And as always, Mike Badger signing out. I'll see you in the next one.